Coming up on Chopper's Politics.
Will you ensure that no vaccine passports will be allowed to be used or demanded in London?
Yes, it's a short answer. Could you imagine going into Tesco's and someone saying, right, where's your passport?
I'm Christopher Hope, chopper to my friends, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent, and this is Chopper's Politics. We have a smorgasbord of interesting guests for you this week, listeners, a spring feast, if you will. I'm lucky enough to have had my first jab, but some of you more youthful listeners might not be in the same boat. And this week, you found out that you're unlikely to get the AstraZeneca vaccine if you're under 30. And we'll be digging into the debate behind that with the Telegraph's science editor, Sarah Knapton. Plus, we'll be speaking to writer Andew McQuillan on why he thinks the government ignores recent events in Northern Ireland at the peril of the Union. But first, Shaun Bailey has been the Conservative London mayoral candidate for a few years now, after COVID delayed last year's mayoral elections. But as we get closer to the actual day, May the 6th, it's not looking too good for the Tory choice. A poll by YouGov for the Mile End Institute put his Labour rival, current London Mayor Sadiq Khan, ahead by 47% to Shaun Bailey's 26%. So I started by asking Shaun Bailey if he paid attention to these numbers.
Look, the only poll that matters is the 6th of May. All the other polls I paid very little attention to. Londoners are beginning to wake up to the race more and more and more and more. And I'll ask any of your listeners who is a Londoner or interested in what's going on in London, do you think Sadiq Khan has done a good job? Do you feel safer? Do you feel there's any prospect of you as a young person or your family members owning a home in London? And of course, do you think Sadiq Khan is the man to open up London to the rest of the world? The answer to all of those questions is no, he has failed. And that is driving Londoners to ask different questions that I have answers for.
How would you sort out the finances of TfL, Shaun Bailey?
Top question, Chopper. This is the question that many a London stops me and asks me, particularly cab drivers. You can imagine the opinions they have. So here's what happens. I want to protect things like free over 60s travel and free under 80s travel and add money to TfL's bottom line. And that means a sponsorship scheme in London. They did a very similar thing in Dubai and raised £400 million. And let's be clear, our district line is the same size as their system. So we have much more room to raise money. And we can use that to protect the services I spoke about. But of course, the real big power here is my London Infrastructure Bank. It's modelled on the model that the German government used to rebuild the finances of Germany after the Second World War. I can leverage the monies we have in London some 10 times over. We will have a £10.9 billion pot to support the development of TfL, and that would help repair TfL's finances.
Where do you draw the line then on sponsoring tube stations? Could you have Westminster sponsored by Huawei, for example, St James's Park sponsored by a tobacco company? Where do you draw the line? Do you not think you're just like damaging these iconic names with commercialism?
Absolutely not. All of these things are temporary. So we, the public, would retain ownership and the rights to administer the names. And the second thing is we will just have guidelines. We have advertising on the tube already and we have ethics and standards around that. And we'll just apply the same system, won't we? Because what we want to do is use the assets that London has to prosper the people of London.
One of the big issues you've got is the outer London congestion charge extension from this October. That means basically moving out the entry charge on London roads from more inner London into really going very near to the north and south circulars. What's your plans for that?
I don't have a problem with that, Chopper, because I simply will not do it. It is a direct response to Sadiq Khan's failure to run Transport for London and indeed London's finances properly. And he's tried to say it's to bolster the green credentials of London. It won't work. If we want to clean the air in London, what we should do is follow my plan to deliver an entirely green bus fleet. That's the equivalent of removing 1.1 million cars from the road, not just heaping tax upon people. And with a zone so large, it'll encourage people to drive around more, not less.
Why drive more? Why would it make you drive more?
Because once you've paid to get into that zone, you'll get your money's worth.
Oh, I see.
With a zone so large, you're very likely to have 2 or 3 places you could worthwhile go. So let's not encourage people to drive around by giving them this quite frankly hideous tax when people are trying to help rebuild the economy of London. We should be getting people to work. We should be getting people to move. We shouldn't be increasing the cost of living in London.
How would you make the streets safer for women in London?
Look, public safety has been my clarion call from the very beginning. I've said I will be on top of that day one. The first thing is this: 8,000 extra police officers on the streets of London. The man and woman power to make London safe.
Paid for by who?
Paid for by myself, because there's savings to be made in City Hall to do this. And of course, the government has pledged extra money as well. The other thing is I'll reopen the 38 police stations that Sadiq Khan has closed. I will put CCTV cameras on every bus stop in London. I will be doubling the amount of police on the British Transport Network. I'll be giving the police the technology to do stop and search properly, and also to do scan and search.
So things like stop and search, more police on the streets, that might raise tensions in some parts of London, no?
What's raising tension in London is the mayor's failure to get on top of public safety. Women are not the only group of Londoners that the mayor has failed. If you're a black Londoner, you are 4 times more likely to be murdered than your neighbour. That is unacceptable. If you're any Londoner, you've suffered a 86% rise in robbery. These are the things that will drive my activities, and these are the things that Londoners are asking for. We are focused on saving lives. The tension that's in London is the fact that London feels slightly dangerous, and I'm going to get on top of that.
How do you make the roads feel safer, just for road traffic accidents and that kind of thing, road safety?
So there's 2 major areas. Firstly, LTNs. They have been dumped on local communities. I will stop them.
I should say that they're called low traffic neighbourhoods, and that's when they fence off, they put planters in and stop cars going down roads just to make them available for cycle lanes.
Well, and walking as well. And everybody wants to cycle and walk, but many of these LTNs, the local people don't want them, because it means that emergency vehicles can't get through. It means that motorbikes are often crowded out or forced onto the pavement. So all of these things happen because there's been very poor planning. I will stop them and make sure any LTN, the local people want it, and the planning is done properly to make the roadway safe. The second piece as well is to look at the balance between cycling and driving in London. We've got into this war where it's cyclists versus drivers. I don't think we need to be there. I think we can get much more safe cycling for cyclists, but also have a more balanced approach, a more balanced conversation around how we use road space. Some of the cycle lanes, some of the provisions put in London have been absolutely ludicrous, and they will have to come out to make the roadways safer.
We're facing the soon-to-be unlocked London. How do you breathe life back into the capital?
There's a number of things. So when you talk about breathing life into London, I've always said this is a combination of protecting our health, but also protecting our wealth. So I've always been in favour of opening up London as quickly and as safely as we can, getting people back into the middle of London. That's the first thing. So if your employer can provide you with a COVID-safe environment, please come back into work. It doesn't matter if you sell insurance or you sell coffee. London is a footfall city, and without that footfall, London struggles. The biggest parts of our business economy suffer, and so does the ecosystem of communities. And in the long term, we need to flex the asset that is London. And the 2 greatest things in London are the people and the actual land. So I want to run a Festival of London, a month-long affair, to try and attract back our foreign visitors when that's safe, to get them back into town, and also just to let families and everybody worldwide enjoy London again. And that'll be arts, anything from arts, crafts, to theatres, to outdoor performances.
When's that, Shaun? When do you plan for that?
So I'll do that in the second year of my term, because it will need some planning. It'll be a month long. I'm focusing on August at the minute.
Yeah. So August next year.
Yes. People who know me will know I'm a massive fan of public art. I love murals and the like. So I'll be looking to run a couple of international competitions to attract attention back to London.
So moving away from money, how it's spent by the mayor, do you think the current mayor's been drawn into these culture wars? He's got this review of controversial statues, hasn't he? Well, what's your view of that? Would you carry on with that review? Do you have a problem with these statues? Should they remain?
Straight away, I've told you I'd have nothing to do with the review. I think the review's contentious. I think he jumped on a bandwagon. It's backfired. It's caused a lot of problems. Everybody knows that there is no country in the world whose history is unblemished. But you have to study it warts and all. That's how we learn. You don't help one black child by removing parts of British history that might be uncomfortable. You learn from them. You value them. You look at them. You move on. And I know this to be a fact. 86% of black Londoners say they don't want statues removed. What we want is an addition. So my parents are part of the Windrush. Let's talk about the Windrush as a positive force it was. Let's do that. But the deeper thing here, Chopper, is, to my mind, Sadiq Khan has been overtly political in all of his goings on. And this is just another one of that. But unfortunately, this is contentious, isn't it? It's dividing communities. I want to bring people together.
It is right that 86% of black Londoners don't care about these statues. What's driving it? Is it a kind of white guilt?
I think sometimes people who are white, who are really well-meaning, have no colour bias at all. They want to make a gesture, want to show that they're trying to support their black friends and colleagues and neighbours. But for me, the way to do that is just to welcome people in. You don't have to flagellate yourself. But making yourself guilty for everything doesn't make me feel better. What makes me feel better is being treated as an equal. I always say to people, I don't want to be tolerated. I don't want racial tolerance. I want acceptance. I want to be loved. You have to imagine marrying me. When you get to the point where you can quite happily marry me, then you're there.
I would happily marry you if you want.
My wife might have a problem with that.
Well, what do you think of the Tony Sewell report? It said that Britain is not institutionally racist.
What I think about the Tony Sewell report, on the left, it was roundly attacked because they don't need it to succeed. But I think there's an important thing here. We have to look at the progress we've made. I had a conversation with a young man, a young white man, and he said to me, if we don't acknowledge some of the progress we've made, then why are we bothering? People will be fatigued and give up. And I certainly know. I mean, look, I'm a young black man. I was born and raised in London. I'm no longer running away from the NF in the street. I do know people who are black, who are barristers, or politicians, or successful businessmen, or brain surgeons. There has been some progress made. Now, I'm not crazy. Of course, racial bias still exists and there's work to be done. But we have to acknowledge that if you're a black person, Britain is certainly one of the best places to be in the world by some way. And I think if you're in the white community, accept that you've been part of that progress. You're not just the problem, you're part of the progress as well. Come on.
Tony Sewell spoke to a sister podcast we have called Planet Normal this week. He said one issue of restoring police trust is to ensure that police officers come from their local communities. Is that a good idea, you think?
I think you should be able to police in any area. So I, as a black man, should be able to police in the middle of Wiltshire and it not be a problem. Having greater representation is good. I welcome that, and I will make a point of trying to recruit police officers from across the racial spectrum. But I issue a challenge to the black community, Indian, Pakistani, all the communities of London. Let us join the police force. We people can't continue to complain about a largely white police force unless our communities are involved in joining in. And I've met quite a few black officers in my time, and the changes are coming. But the real thing for the actual police force is to make sure we do more about retention and promotion. That there's a comfort from seeing someone like yourself progressing. It feels possible for you. That, I think, is where we get a step change.
So it's an idea of so-called snowy peaks that have more senior minority ethnic officers. That'd be a good start.
But the key thing is always on merit. I believe enough in the talent in the black community that with a few guiding hands, we will bubble to the top naturally.
Does the Tory party have a problem with race, do you think? There's been an issue with this Islamophobia report, not yet published. You've known the Conservative Party for a long time. You worked with David Cameron in Number 10 all those years ago. Is there a problem at the top of the party?
I've been probably a member for going on 15 years now, and I've been helped a great deal, and it's normally by very, very senior people. I think the Tory party, like any institution in this country, needs to figure out how it reaches out more and more and more. Britain's become more multiracial, not less. So there's lessons to always be learned. And I think this report and the openness and being prepared to expose the party to criticism demonstrates a bravery there, a new level of bravery. It's a situation that the Tory party wants to solve, if only for its own relevance, if nothing else.
Your tagline is a fresh start for London, and we're talking on a Zoom call here for those who can't see, with Shaun Bailey, and it looks like you're an advert for Sillet Bang or something. Or in old money that was called GIF, I think. So how are you going to clean up London? The hot weather saw parks covered in rubbish. Should it be policed better? Fines for leaving rubbish out in parks and streets?
This is going to sound strange. One of my pet loathings is littering. Yeah. I live right out on the east of London now, so we have a fly tipping as a problem as well. It drives me bananas. I really hate it. But I also, here's my response. I believe in people. I believe if we go back and educate young Londoners in particular, I remember when I was in school, there's a big anti-litter campaign. I would do a London-wide litter campaign just to remind people this rubbish does not pick itself up. Please use the bins. I think when you talk about more serious fly tipping, my extra 8,000 police officers means that they'll have the capacity to follow up on things like this because it dirties the environment. I think it changes the mood of living in their particular place. And obviously I want that mood to be positive. Policing the parks is a thing of responsibility. We need to ask people, regulate your own behavior. I don't think we need to, have guards on every gate saying that empty your pockets, have you got a wrapper in there? I don't think we need to do that. We do need to ask people though to take responsibility.
Now, Shaun Bailey, Sadiq Khan has pledged to set up an independent commission on drugs. He may try and legalise cannabis. What's your view on that?
Where to begin? Chopper, I think this is a sleight of hand. The mayor is setting up a commission on something he has absolutely no power to deliver. What he should do is concentrate on the day job, which is making the streets of London safe and sending this signal so that he can be treated as soft and lovely and liberal in the press is ridiculous. Focus on our safety, Sadiq.
What's your personal view on cannabis? Have you ever smoked it?
Look, I've been a youth worker for over 20 years. I've seen the damage that cannabis does to communities. And Sadiq Khan will be the first person to say, why don't we have mental health provision for young people, forgetting he was the person who legalized and exposed young people to psychosis, etc. I lost my own brother to addiction. I know many people smoke cannabis and are fine, but many, many, many people smoke cannabis and are not. It is not big and it is not clever to legalize cannabis. And the thing here, it is poor communities that will suffer from the rise in crime and also the social effect of it as well.
Would you keep Cressida Dick in post?
Yes. I don't think Cressida Dick is London's problem. I think Sadiq Khan is. Imagine you're the CEO of a company and the chairperson won't help you out at all. That's the situation she's in. And Sadiq Khan has thrown the police under the bus every opportunity he's gotten. Look what he talked about with Extinction Rebellion. So he chose to support Extinction Rebellion, but he wouldn't support the Vigil for Sir Everard. He's picked side and made policing too political, and it's made it tougher for Cressida than it needed to be.
Do police need these more powers to deal with the likes of Extinction Rebellion? If they're causing serious disruption to Londoners, do you accept why they need more powers to remove them?
I'll put it to you like this. I was stood on the bridge when the Extinction Rebellion protest was going on. I was still on Westminster Bridge. And a guy was walking across the bridge with a big chalk saw in his hand. And he said, Shaun, get these people off the streets of London. I'm a chippy. I don't get paid if I don't work. He said, it's a fun day out for them. But for me, it's destroying my livelihood. We are all focused on making the planet greener. We are all focused on the green emergency, but you can't do that by bringing the livelihoods of 5+ million people to a halt. Of course, the police need ways to deal with modern protesting. Modern protesting needs modern police.
Do you think, just looking more widely now, has the Tories' focus on the red wall seats worked against their support for London? London is the kind of engine of the economic engine which you'll be in charge of if you win on May the 6th. Do you think that the focus on the north has impacted on support for the Tories in London?
I'd say no, and I'll tell you why. 2 reasons. I spoke to Boris and Rishi, so everybody realised I'm first name basis with the Chancellor and the PM. I spoke to both. Of course,
I expect it.
And they both made it quite clear. They're aware that any rebuilding of this country starts in London. For instance, my plan around £10.9 billion for infrastructure bank, that money won't be spent in London. It'll be spent in the country. We don't build buses in London. We don't build trains in London. They're built elsewhere. So the money goes out into the country. They're both aware of that. London is great, not despite the rest of the country, but because of the rest of the country.
Is there one thing you just disagree with Boris Johnson on? What's the one thing?
VAT-free shopping in London. It's essential that we have VAT-free shopping in London. I'm adamant about that.
And have you been in touch with your friend Rishi about that?
I have. Rishi is very open. Rishi has a slightly different mission to me. He obviously has to stand up the whole country's economy. My focus is London's economy. But I made it clear, returning back to our international shoppers will be key for building that number back as we come out of COVID restrictions.
Now, we've got some questions here from followers of us on Twitter. I'll just run them through quickly. How will you help these poor families stuck in these flats who are the victims of the cladding scandal? There's money coming out, of course, from Robert Jenrick at MHCLG and the government, but many of them are seriously in a really bad state. Many are feeling or could be bankrupt, made homeless by this. They can't sell their flats. What else can you do to help them?
So I have been contacted by a number of these groups, and they really changed my politics. They pushed me and they said, Shaun, you're in or you're out. What do you want? So I push the government to pay more and to pay all. That's the only response. We've got to get on top of the government.
You want more money from Robert Jenrick's fund?
Yeah, because I have been a leaseholder, and I know you are held to ransom. There's nothing you can do, and your life is in pause. So we'll push more. I think we need to have a little look at the fire safety testing regime as well, because there's a backlog of work to be done because there just isn't enough professionals to make that happen. It's a small but important point. We need to get on top of that as well. But ultimately, I will campaign along with leaseholders in particular, because they're really trapped, to get more money. I mean, the golden standard would be to have the government act as the insurer of last resort. I understand why the government are reluctant to do that, but I think you're talking about people's entire lives. And in this one case, they could do it and should.
Yeah. Adrian asks, will you ensure, as promised by another candidate, Lawrence Fox, that no vaccine passports or certificates will be allowed to be used or demanded in London apart from for international travel?
Yes, it's a short answer. I'm not. Could you imagine going into Tesco's and someone saying, "Right, where's your passport?" I just don't think.
It's not Tesco's or chemists, but it might be at pubs and bars and nightclubs.
But my point is anyway. I'm being facetious when I say Tesco's. Yeah. But I just don't think it will work. I don't think it works with a British sensibility, and I don't think it works from an admin point of view. What we need to do is observe the rules, get as far through this vaccination program as we can, and just be driven by data, not fear.
Have you been jabbed yet?
No, I haven't. I'm very low risk, apparently.
Of course, you're a bit younger than me, but will you be jabbed? You'll accept the jab when it comes your way?
100%. Yeah. Look, my community in particular has had a lot of skepticism around the jab. So very early on with my mother, we made a video and I took her to have her jab. I've also worked as a volunteer in under the vaccination centres in Kingsbury Temple. I've made it very clear to people I am pro-jab. How did we get rid of TB? It was with jabs. Come on, people. Yeah. Get involved.
Just final question, a light one here. Larry the Cat asks, do you like cats, Shaun Bailey?
I'm a bit more of a dog and a rabbit man. I say rabbits because my children keep rabbits from time to time. And who doesn't like a good dog? Come on.
Look, Shaun Bailey, it's been great to talk to you, and best of luck to you and all the candidates in May's election, and may the best candidate win.
Thank you very much. And remember this, Chopper, London needs a fresh start.
Right, stay with us. In just one moment, we'll be talking about why violence has flared on the streets of Northern Ireland this week. Is it Brexit linked? Is it COVID related? We'll dig down into that very issue and find out right after this.
Hi listeners, it's Bryony Gordon here, popping into this podcast to tell you all about another Telegraph series called Bryony Gordon's Mad World. It's a podcast in which I chat to household names and unsung heroes about their mental health, from Stacey Solomon to therapists and doctors on the front line. We talk about looking after ourselves as we heave ourselves out of lockdown and remind you that it's totally normal to feel weird. Search Mad World wherever you usually download your podcasts.
And we're back. Now, in recent days, Northern Ireland has seen some of the worst violence in decades. Loyalists and nationalists have clashed with police in West Belfast, and earlier this week a bus was firebombed. Writer Andew McQuillan wrote a piece at the beginning of this week in The Spectator, asking why nobody was talking more about Northern Ireland. So I thought I'd prove him wrong and invite him onto this podcast. Andew McQuillan, welcome to Choppers Politics. Now, you've written a very good article this week for The Spectator titled, Why is Nobody Talking About Northern Ireland? Why is that, Andew?
It's a very good question, Chris, and I think it's symptomatic of a wider issue in British politics that Northern Ireland perhaps doesn't get the attention that it deserves, particularly given the brunt that it is bearing as a result of the introduction of the so-called sea border due to the Prime Minister's Brexit deal, and anger amongst the Unionist and loyalist community about that deal has manifested this week. And now everyone seems to be talking about Northern Ireland because there's a burning bus on the Shankill Road and 55 police officers have been injured. And it's a shame that it's taken that to get this issue up in headlines.
Yeah, so if we just rewind slightly for listeners here, what started this trouble? It was a funeral, wasn't it?
Yes. Well, last year, Bobby Story died. He is regarded as one of the godfathers of the provisional IRA movement. And in traditional Republican fashion, they had a show of strength funeral for him in West Belfast, which, if anyone has seen the photos, can see that it drove a coach and horses through Northern Ireland's COVID regulations about mass gatherings. And that caused huge anger, not only amongst people who have abided by those regulations and have had funerals where lots of people weren't able to attend, but it's also caused huge anger because last week the public prosecutor decided not to pursue any charges against the Sinn Féin leadership who had attended that funeral for their breach of COVID regulations, which included the Deputy First Minister, Michelle O'Neill, which, as you can imagine, caused huge furore, which in the loyalist community, who have in their mind a perception of two-tier policing in Northern Ireland, feel that this demonstrated Sinn Féin were simply acting with impunity and being encouraged by the police and the judicial system. And that manifested itself in a riot which took place in Belfast on Friday night in the loyalist Sandy Row area, which has escalated since then. The gathering in Sandy Row was ostensibly about the protocol. The protest was gathered under that basis. But the Story funeral has in effect catalysed the fact that loyalists now feel they can go out and protest because Sinn Féin haven't been taken to task over their mass gatherings.
So there's a degree of even-handedness from the authorities, and then you add into that this concern about the sea border, which, as you mentioned before, has been imposed between GB and Northern Ireland because of the Brexit deal. And does that mean the Unionists feel more under siege?
Yes, they certainly do. There's a degree of nihilism and fatalism inherent within the Unionist political mindset that even prior to Brexit, they felt very much on the edge of the Union. And that's now very much the case due to the barriers that exist between NI and GB. They feel that the government has, and indeed the EU, has internalised a nationalist interpretation and solution to the Brexit border conundrum by sticking it in the Irish Sea. And in their view, this is the culmination of a 20-year process since the Good Friday Agreement, whereby Unionists have been continually on the back foot and nationalists have been gaining the upper hand. All of those issues were bubbling away, but the Brexit outworkings, as it were, have catalysed and crystallised for Unionists this feeling that they are stuck, as it were, that they're not being listened to. And unfortunately, because it would appear that political unionism has failed to halt these perceived reversals, many within the loyalist community now feel they have no course but to lash out in the scenes that we've seen in Belfast, in Londonderry and in Antrim over recent days.
In your article for The Spectator, you call it a trauma. The sea border is a trauma for the Unionist community. Is that overstating it?
No, I wouldn't say so. I think any time, if some listeners will remember things like the Anglo-Irish Agreement, for example, which gave Dublin a consultative role in Northern Ireland's affairs, and the huge outpouring of anger that caused. This is a similar situation. They feel that the Good Friday Agreement set out terms about parity of esteem and mutual respect, and the compromise of the Good Friday Agreement allowed Unionists, under the basis of the principle of consent, to have the GB link unfettered, whereas nationalists, given the joint EU membership between the UK and the Republic of Ireland, could have greater sort of closeness with Dublin. The fact that this Brexit outworking has undermined that has in effect undermined an element of the agreement. And I think there is unfortunately now within loyalism a questioning of the purpose of the process.
So the point here then, it's a failure of the politics. The politicians have failed to keep this even-handedness, which is so important in Northern Ireland, and that's led to this trouble we've seen over the past 4 days in Belfast.
Exactly, that's led to it. That's the high politics element of it. But I think there's a sort of low politics element of it. Northern Ireland's devolved government is inherently dysfunctional. We all know that it's sort of stopped and started over recent years due to various things. But even then, its delivery of basic services within Northern Ireland is not particularly great. And we have still 23 years on from the Good Friday Agreement, vexatious issues to do with more peace walls going up since the ceasefires than were erected during the Troubles. We've got the issue of integrated education and the fact that the vast majority of Northern Ireland's children are still educated in separate systems from each other. And the fact that there's huge levels of working class underattainment within Northern Ireland as well. So if you add the sort of economic circumstances which are arguably being faced in the north of England and post-industrial areas in Scotland and Wales, if you add in the tense constitutional situation in Northern Ireland, which hasn't been handled properly, there's just a sense of despair which I think has spiralled out in recent days, and the government do need to take a firm hand to deal with this. They speak about levelling up for England quite a lot, and I think there's certainly a package that they could bring in for Northern Ireland which would hopefully address these measures, but whether the political energy in number 10 is there to do that remains to be seen.
So, Andrew, we mentioned there the local politicians and their failure to resolve this. And of course, there is a lot of blame attached to this Brexit deal. What do you think the UK government is doing and what can it do more of? Are you hearing enough from Brandon Lewis, who's the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland?
Well, I understand he's due to visit Northern Ireland in the next day or so to discuss the situation with the party leaders and with the police service there. But aside from tweets from him and tweets from the Prime Minister, we've not had much. And indeed, Matt Hancock, when asked about this, said that it was a devolved matter for the Northern Ireland government to solve.
That's unbelievable. I mean, it is not, is it? Because
No.
It's been half caused by the implementation by the EU and UK government, arguably, of this Brexit deal.
Indeed. And if we contrast the treatment that the situation in Northern Ireland's received with the rioting that we've seen in Bristol and the swift condemnation that received from senior figures within government, I mean, it is a quite stark contrast. So the government needs to understand this as a consequence of its behaviour, and it really needs to start listening to concerns from across the community about how this gets sorted.
Do you detect a nervousness in London about what to say about Northern Ireland, i.e. they feel they can't say anything because it risks being wrongly interpreted one way or the other? So no one says anything proper. I mean, tweeting is hardly enough, right? So no one's saying enough. No one is engaging with it properly, and therefore this situation can spiral. I mean, do you think there's a nervousness which is fueling the situation?
Indeed, and that is occasionally a criticism that is made about the Northern Ireland office, that it sits on the fence too much. And that was evidenced in the recent New Decade, New Deal approach negotiated by Julian Smith and Simon Coveney, that the nationalists in Northern Ireland had someone in the room batting for them in the shape of Coveney, but the Unionists had Julian Smith's studied neutrality. And that is a difficult issue for the Northern Ireland office to face in a post-conflict society. But it's when the government's talking up its Unionist credentials in other parts of the country, it doesn't seem to be doing so in Northern Ireland, but I do agree that it does face a challenge there because of the circumstances. But we certainly need perhaps a more proactive and a more sort of thinking Secretary of State who will, in the mould of a Smith or a Peter Brook or a Mo Mowlam style figure, would get in on the ground, try and understand the issues, and ultimately try and get a solution for everyone. But the solution has to be done within Northern Ireland. That's where the work has to be done on a social level and on an economic level. But also, as we return to the high politics, there does need to be a recognition, not only in Whitehall, but in Dublin and in Brussels, of the fact that the protocol has in effect hardwired certain elements of unionism and loyalism to feel this way. And as we approach the summer, we always know that the marching season in Northern Ireland is a particularly vexatious one. I imagine there'll be Orangemen out there who feel that given Sinn Féin weren't prosecuted over the Story funeral, that they'll be able to take to the streets in mass numbers to conduct their parades. And that's a flashpoint which needs to be negotiated as well.
Andew McQuillan, you've written a great piece this week in The Spectator. We'll put that into the show notes of this episode. And do come on again to give us your take on Northern Ireland. It's been really good to have you on. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Now, this week we learned that anyone under 30 in the UK will be offered an alternative COVID-19 jab to the AstraZeneca vaccine amid ongoing fears, however remote, about blood clots. The MHRA, the medicines regulator, has said that the benefits still outweigh the risks for most people. But the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation has recommended that younger people be offered a different vaccine. So what does all this mean for you Chopper listeners lucky enough to be under 30? Let's find out with Sarah Knapton, the science editor of The Telegraph. Sarah Knapton, welcome to Chopper's Politics.
Hello, it's lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
It's our pleasure. Now listen, would you have the AstraZeneca vaccine?
I would, but then I'm quite old. I mean, I'm 42, so it's really for my age group, there's nothing to worry about at all. The benefits way outweigh the risks of it. So yeah, I wouldn't have any problem having it. Definitely for someone in their 40s, it's fine. And anyone under 30, it's really fine. So yeah, I have no problem with it.
It's not really fine for the under 30, is it? Because there's a 1 in a million chance of dying from a blood clot.
There is, but it's a very low risk, isn't it? I mean, I think this is one of the problems that people get a bit confused by statistics and what that actually means. I mean, that's such a low chance of having any problems. But the problem is that the chance of an under 30 having any problems with COVID is also very small. So you get to this risk-benefit equation where you start to think, well, you know, for all that risk is small, the risk from COVID is also very, very small. And actually, for under 30s at the moment, the risk does outweigh the benefits very slightly. But it doesn't mean the risk has got any worse. It hasn't. It's just there's no point taking that chance. That's what they've determined.
Why do you think the MHRA took so long to spell out the risks, even though they are this small? Do you think that they may have wanted most of the people to get their jabs in the country before setting out these very small risks?
I think there's definitely been an issue with worry that this will stop people having it, that people will get more worried than they need to be, and it will spook people into not having the jab. Having said that, I do think they've had to be ultra cautious because it really up till now hasn't been clear if there was a causal link at all. I mean, when you've got a big rollout like this, it could just have been a background population problem. So in trials, like you have maybe 30 to 50,000 people involved. So when your risk is in the 1 out of a million, you're never going to pick up that risk in a trial. But when you're rolling out it to tens of millions, suddenly you have these tiny, tiny things that are creeping up. And they could just be because you would expect a blood clot in that many people. And so it's quite hard to tease apart what's actually being caused by the vaccine and what isn't.
Yeah.
And I think they had to go back through every case report and just look at them and think, well, did this person have a higher risk that would have made them more likely to have had it anyway? So were they obese? Did they have diabetes? Were they on the pill? Did they have a history of clotting? Some sort of genetic problem that made them more susceptible, all that kind of thing. They had to go through every case report. And then I think the other thing was they just didn't understand how it could be causing it. So it's only very recently that they've come up with a mechanism that might be behind it. And so now they're saying, actually, yeah, that it's probable or at least possible that it is causing it. And we now think we know why. So once you've factored in all those things, you can see why it has taken them so much time. And then the other thing that's really interesting, I think, is that actually the reason this is a problem now and that they've made this decision to say to the under 30s have a different jab is because we're doing so well with the vaccine programme. So if we'd have had this discussion in January when we were at peak infections, the benefit of a vaccine, even for the under 30s, would have way outweighed the risk. It would have been about 6 times as beneficial. But the problem is we've now got transmission at such a low rate, the chances of a young person catching it and then being seriously ill is so low now that it's tipped over into that point where it's no longer beneficial, it's no longer worth the risk. So in a way, the reason we're here is, it's a victim of the success of the vaccine programme.
I was struck by how just last week on the 1st of April, Nadine Zahawi gave an answer in Parliament saying the MHRA issued a statement on the 18th of March setting out that the available evidence did not suggest that blood clots in veins are caused by the Oxford AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine. So I suppose we are in a moving situation, aren't we? That, even in Parliament just last week, the Vaccines Minister was standing by that statement from the MHRA on March the 18th.
Yeah, I think that's slightly wrong. It's interesting because I was in that briefing and that isn't what they said. They said they didn't know. And what's interesting is but I think the government was so scared that people were going to be put off having the jab, that they kind of went a bit over the top. Definitely the Department of Health, the MHRA, I wrote a story after that press conference saying, the causal link hadn't been proven yet, but it hadn't also been unproven as well. I mean, it was this whole thing of absence of evidence does not mean evidence of absence. And I got quite a lot of angry phone calls from the Department of Health and the MHRA saying, you can't say that, there's no causal link. And I sort of said to them, we haven't said there's a causal link, but we're not ruling it out either because you haven't ruled it out. But then they were still quite cross that we hadn't ruled it out. Do you see what I mean? So for all the fact they hadn't, they were angry that the press was saying that it hadn't been ruled out. So we were in this very tricky situation of, I think, almost the government, the MHRA, desperately not wanting to put anyone off having a vaccine, while also kind of, I don't know, would it be fair to say massaging the truth slightly? I think maybe that's going too far because I think it was from the best of intentions, but I did feel quite pressured into saying there wasn't a link even though they hadn't ruled it out.
Yeah, that's why the press is important in these things and holding the government to account all the time. Now, you've written a piece this week also coming up on Monday. We're reaching herd immunity in this country. Can you explain what herd immunity means? It's like a flashback term from last year, isn't it?
Yeah, so it basically means that enough people now have some immunity to the virus, either through vaccination or previous infection, that there's enough people that you almost form a ring around other people that don't have it. And so it stops it spreading, essentially. We do it with lots of diseases now with vaccinations. It's how we stop measles and things like that. And there's a certain threshold, which moves actually quite a lot, the herd immunity threshold, depending on the infection in the community. But at the moment, we seem to just be about to tip into it, according to UCL. Other scientists don't think we're quite there yet, but their modelling seems to be a bit more optimistic, suggesting we're sort of about to get there. I mean, the last time the ONS put out antibody figures from their infection survey, we were about 54% of the population that now has protection, and that was March 14th, so we're now nearly a month ahead of that. So you would like to think that we must be approaching herd immunity. I think the guy who was behind the modelling, Carl Friston at UCL, yesterday said that if we release too soon and an infection goes back up, i.e. the R rate goes back up to sort of well above 1, that then pushes up the risk threshold again. So we could come back out of it, if you see what I mean. So or we might not be able to reach it if infection rates go quite high, which it's difficult to work out exactly where that is. But then the other thing that's quite interesting is that as we approach summer, the herd immunity threshold, according to UCL, goes right down, almost to sort of 40%. You don't need that much immunity once the virus is very low in the community because so few people will have it to be able to pass it on. So it's interesting, and obviously it's modelling, so we can't say it's definitely going to happen on Monday. It's just that's when they're predicting.
So, this is so well explained, by the way, Sarah Knapton. Thank you so much for explaining this all so clearly to our listeners. What I don't understand is why are models warning of a third UK COVID wave when we have this, maybe all adults receiving the vaccine by July, and we have this issue of herd immunity underlining that?
So I think the models that are coming out sort of from Warwick and the London School and Imperial generally tend to be sort of worst case scenario models. It's sometimes not picked up on like that, but that's what they're trying to show. And so this is kind of the worst that could happen if everything goes wrong. I don't think it will happen. They seem to have especially the Imperial model was quite behind in its level of protection. It suggests that we're about 34% immunity. Well, we already know we're way above that. The ONS have put out figures showing that we're sort of way above half the country is now immune. So even just that factor alone will have meant that their models can't be right. And of course, they haven't factored in things like seasonality, which we know is a massive. It's massively important to respiratory viruses. You just don't tend to get respiratory viruses peaking in the summer. I think South Africa slightly did, but it seems to be an outlier, and it really didn't get that high. So I just think that lots of things weren't factored into the models, which are going to be crucial to whether we have a third wave or not. We're at very, very low deaths now, very low infections. Tim Spector was just talking from King's earlier on, saying he doesn't think we're going to have a third wave now. So unless something terrible happens in Europe that then spreads over here, I can't see we're going to have much of a problem in the summer.
And by something terrible, you mean a new variant of concern?
Possibly a new variant, or possibly one of the variants they've already got, like the South African one or the Brazilian one coming over here, because they seem to evade the immunity that we do have, and vaccines don't seem to work as well on them. But the good thing is the UK variant, which is the one that's basically the dominant strain now, is very infectious, but also doesn't seem to be as lethal. And all the vaccines work against it, and prior immunity seems to. So as long as that just keeps, ploughing ahead and winning the fight against the other variants, I don't see we'll have a problem. And that seems to be happening in Europe as well. But then if infections really run out of control in Europe, then you could have an overspill. And I know that's definitely what the government scientists are worried about, which is why there's still lots of travel bans in place and quarantine and things, because there are concerns that we could have a washover from Europe.
Sarah Knapton, thank you for joining us this week on Choppers Politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And in the show notes of this episode, we'll put a link to that article about herd immunity being reached on Monday, so you can take your own view on what the evidence shows. Well, that's all for this week. I'd love to know what you thought about the topics we discussed. Are you a Londoner with a view on who best represents you in the upcoming mayoral elections? Are you a Chopper listener in Northern Ireland who wants to give us your view on events there? Are you a younger listener a bit peeved you won't get a chance to have the AZ vaccine? Do get in touch. You can share your thoughts by emailing us chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk or find us on Twitter. We're at Choppers Podcast. Thank you to my guests this week, Shaun Bailey, Andew McQuillan, and of course Sarah Knapton. Thank you to my producers, Louisa Wells, Elliot Lampett, and Theo Luludis. But most importantly of all, thank you to you for listening. If you're so inclined, please do leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other people find this show. And finally, these podcasts wouldn't get made without the support of our brilliant Telegraph subscribers. If you're not one already, why not go to telegraph.co.uk/chopper and get your first month subscription completely free of charge. And of course, if you can, please buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph newspaper. Until next time though, cheerio!